Okay, so in the last video, we spoke about the Balfour Declaration and how England was the first country to support with official policy the idea that within Palestine there should be a national home for the Jewish people. And that was a major accomplishment for the Zionist movement, because as much as they want to have a home, they've got to get other people on board with the idea. So let's take a look at a map to appreciate what's about to happen. Here we have the map of the Ottoman Empire, which was also known as the Turkish Empire. It began in 1453, but you can see it covered a tremendous swath of the world, the Middle East. And over here, you can see over a period of time, they were losing various parts of it. What's important for us to understand is this area, which is Palestine, which was given to the British after World War I. It becomes known as the area of the British Mandate. So let's take a look at that. So here we have this area of land. It was agreed that Britain would get control and rule over this area. Formerly, this green and beige area was all Palestine. It was really one color, let's say. But then in 1921, it becomes close to Jewish settlement, and it becomes formally known as Transjordan. So the possibility for the Jews settling anywhere is in this tract of land, which is to the west of the Sea of Galilee, right over here. So now let's get an understanding why things became complicated for the British, and unfortunately why they turned on the Jewish people. So let's put here in the middle the British. On one side we have the Jews, and the other side we have the Arabs. So we said before we have the Balfour Declaration, 1917. And many people think when they look at the Middle East situation that you have these Jews who are newcomers. I mean, it was only 1917 that there was even an idea, a formal recognition of the idea that Jews should get back. And they're going to be entering the neighborhood of all these established nations, Arab nations. And they're going into this neighborhood as the newcomer. But what many people don't realize is that the Arab nations were being established from the start during this time. For example, 1920, Syria is formed as a nation. Then we have in 1921, Iraq, a new nation. Then shortly after that, next year, Jordan is formally now a nation. And 1932, Saudi Arabia is created as a nation. And then 1943, Lebanon is created as a nation. So Lebanon was formally a nation, just 5 years before Israel became a state. So this is a whole new landscape of nations in the Middle East. So what happens now with the British? Well, in the end, the British favor the Arabs for a number of reasons. First of all, the Arabs are protesting the whole idea of Jews coming back to this area of the world and establish themselves as their own people. Secondly, they have a lot of oil, and that clearly is a big incentive for the British to go with the Arabs. And thirdly, we have good old anti-Semitism amongst the British Parliament, amongst the military. So the Arabs are going to have the British ear. The Jews are going to not get the ear, and they're going to be rejected. So in a nutshell, the British, like the Arabs, and the Jews are going to face growing resistance from the British to get any support despite the Balfour Declaration. So now let's take a look back on the Jewish side post the Balfour Declaration. So we have immigration that's going to happen in stages to Israel. Prior to 1917, there were about 100,000 Jews in Israel. Then from 1919 to 29, the population doubles. We have another 115,000 Jews in the land. And then from 1929 to 39, this is the years where we have the rise of Hitler. So now Jews are trying to get out of Europe. We have another 250,000 Jews, which means we have close to about 500,000 Jews in the land of Israel by 39, before World War II breaks out. Now the Arabs are watching this. Clearly they don't want the Jews coming into the land. So in 1929, we have the beginning of Arab riots and massacres, a well-known terrible massacre in Hebron of the Jewish community there. And that's going to go on for a number of years. So what are the British going to do? So in 1937, they have the Peel Commission, which is an attempt to work out some type of resolution between the Arabs and the Jews. And they end up recommending that there should be a partition of Palestine into two areas, one for the Arabs and one for the Jews. And that's the first time partition was suggested. That's in 1937. Now, the Arabs outright rejected that idea. There's more conflict, more fighting. And therefore, the British in 1939 come up with their white paper, which is now an immigration policy where they're going to restrict the number of immigration of Jews to the land down to a trickle of only 12,000 Jews a year. Now, this is 1939. This is right at the beginning of World War II. So you can imagine, just as Jews are doing everything they can to get out and escape the inferno, which is Europe, Israel is no longer really an option. There's only 12,000 Jews being allowed officially to get into the land. So during the Holocaust, Jews were trying to get into the country illegally. Unfortunately, the British had set up a blockade preventing them, and therefore only about 110,000 Jews got through. So as the Jews are trying to find refuge out of Germany or out of places in Europe that they're being executed, unfortunately, the land of Israel is closed off to them in large part. So this, of course, is going to lead to Jewish resistance. And the number of different groups were formed representing the Jews and dealing with the British. First, there was the Jewish Agency. That was the officially recognized Jewish organization at the time because there was no government. Ben-Gurion was the head of it. And overall, his position was not to antagonize the British, to create, further problems with them. But they did have an organization, an underground military called the Haganah. And their job was to protect the Jewish settlements. But again, their way of dealing with it was to practice restraint when they could. So, of course, many Jews were not happy with that, and they felt there had to be a more aggressive approach with the British. One of the organizations was the Irgun. It was led by Vladimir Jabotinsky. Menachem Begin, who eventually became a prime minister of Israel, he also became head of the organization at one point, and they organized counterattacks, which we're going to talk about in a moment. There was also one other organization I'm going to point out called the Lehi, or referred to as the Lehi or Stern Gang. The British called them the Stern Gang because their founder was Avram Stern. Yitzhak Shamir, who eventually also became a prime minister of Israel, was a member of that gang. So let's look at three major blows that the Irgun coordinated against the British. The first was in 1946. They blew up the King David Hotel, which is in Jerusalem. That, at the time, was the British headquarters, military headquarters. So you can imagine how devastating that was to the psyche of the British. They had been warned. The Irgun warned them to get out, but they did not want to listen. Unfortunately, some Jews were killed in that attack as well. Then in 1947, the Irgun organized the breakout of the Akko prison. That's where many Jewish resistance fighters were being held by the British. Then in 1947, they hung 2 British officers as revenge for all the hangings of Irgun members committed by the British. So these 3 events dealt a tremendous blow to British pride, and it diminished the resolve to want to maintain their mandate over the land. So in the end, they're going to give it up and pass it on to the UN to decide what to do. And we're going to cover that in the next video. So we're picking up with the changed draft of the Balfour Declaration. We have the Ottoman Empire. The British have the mandate. Transjordan ends up becoming prohibited for Jews to settle there in 1921. And then we looked at the relationship of the British to the Jews and to the Arabs. We pointed out that after the Balfour Declaration in 1917, many Arab nations were being formed for the first time. 1920 is Syria, 21 is Iraq, 1922 is Jordan, 1932 is Saudi Arabia, and 5 years before the State of Israel, in 1943 is Lebanon. Between the two, the British definitely favored the Arabs for a number of reasons. First of all, the Arabs were putting up a lot of protests. Also, they had the oil. There was just, good old anti-Semitism always at work and always present. And therefore, the love was to the Arabs, and many things were done against the Jews. Jews were immigrating in stages at this point. 100,000 Jews were in the land before 1917. Then, between 1919 and 1929, another 115,000 Jews came, so it doubled. Then, the 10 years before the Holocaust and the rise of Hitler, 250,000 Jews came. Then, in 1929, Arab rights began. So, in 1937, we have the Peel Commission, and that's where partition was proposed for the first time, which the Arabs rejected. In 1939, the British come out with their white paper restricting immigration, Jewish immigration, to 12,000 Jews. And of course, this is right at the beginning of the Holocaust. So what happens? During the Holocaust, Jews are trying to come in illegally. The British set up a blockade to prevent Jews from coming in. Only about 110,000 Jews get through, which leads to Jewish resistance. We have the Jewish Agency, which is the official organization of the Jewish people, led by Ben-Gurion, and the Haganah, their underground military. Their job is to protect the settlements, but overall they practiced restraint against the British. We have the Irgun, which is much more aggressive, led by Vladimir Jabotinsky. Begin was a part of it. They organized counterattacks, which we're going to talk about. And we have the Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang, and Yitzhak Shamir was a part of that. The 3 major blows was the blowing of the King David, we have the breakout of the Akko prison, and also the hanging of the 2 British officers. At this point, the British no longer want to maintain their mandate over the land.